Hello and welcome to the SIWI Sofa, where we sit down with some of the most interesting participants at the World Water Week to learn more about the array of water-related issues being discussed this week in Stockholm. My name is Eric Paglia, host of the SIWI Sofa, and the name of this session is Payments for Watershed Services. This is our 14th session of the SIWI Sofa, and it's actually the first time we're getting to meet an economist and get an economic perspective on water management. So I'd like to welcome Professor Roy Brouwer, Professor of Economics, and the Executive Director of the Water Institute at the University of Waterloo.
Exactly.
Welcome, Roy. Very nice to have
Thank
you
you.
at the SIWI Sofa.
Thank you.
So payments for watershed services, that's a topic, and this is something you've done a lot of research on. So could you please explain to us what this concept entails and how payments for watershed services differ from traditional approaches to water management?
Yeah. Payments for watershed services is based on the idea that the providers of services that are provided often free of charge by ecosystems are reimbursed, compensated for the efforts that they often have to make to provide the services. That could be, for example, upstream land users, landowners who invest in forest conservation efforts to reduce soil runoff into rivers, which are beneficial to downstream water users, irrigators, public utilities for drinking water supply, and so on. So the providers of these services are compensated for their efforts and receive a price, and that's an agreed price between the provider of the ecosystem service and the beneficiary of the ecosystem service.
So this is a kind of ecosystem service. I mean, the concept of ecosystem services has been around for a while, but this is sort of more specific to the water sector.
It's not very specific to the water sector, but there are a lot of examples of payment for ecosystem services schemes which combine land and water management efforts. The example that I just gave you is very typical, where you have a watershed, where you have a upstream land user who does or refrains from doing certain things like deforesting the land, which has very beneficial effects on water users downstream. So there are a lot of examples where there is a combination of land and water involved in these payment schemes.
And where have payments for watershed services been applied or implemented so far?
Primarily, they were developed and implemented in developing countries, developing economies, especially in South and Central America, countries like Costa Rica, where some of the first PES schemes were introduced in the 1990s, Bolivia, Colombia, Ecuador, Guatemala, Honduras, but also in Asia, in China, where one of the largest PES schemes is found with more than 1 million participants. India, Philippines, Indonesia, Vietnam, for example, but also in South Africa, working with water is another example of a huge PES scheme.
Is there a reason why they're more common in developing economies as opposed to industrialized economies?
There is an important reason in that it's a very popular new policy instrument in that it relieves the pressure on government budgets, which is especially an issue in developing economies. So it allows the market to play a role in environmental protection. A lot of these governments protect the ecosystems, forests, for example, and they have to allocate money to that. And with the global crisis, for example, at the moment, financial crisis, there is a lot of pressure on these government budgets, and by allowing the market to play a role, it really helps to alleviate the pressure on these government budgets.
So have these PWS schemes been successful in these places you mentioned before, and what factors would you say can lead to successful implementation of payments for watershed services?
So the empirical evidence on the success rate of these schemes is limited and shows very mixed results. There are a number of examples where it seems to work very effectively, and those are often so-called user finance schemes, where there is a direct relationship between the provider of the ecosystem service, for example, the upstream landowner or land user, and the downstream water users, the irrigators or the public utility. In those cases where there is clear insight in the costs and benefits of setting up a PES, a payment for watershed services scheme, in those cases it has clear benefits and it has been very successful. In other cases where the objectives and the direct relationship with the environmental problem involved is less clear, the evidence is also less clear about how effective the scheme is in addition to existing other policy instruments.
And what sort of institutions and stakeholders are involved in the implementation of PWS schemes?
That again varies a lot from case to case. And it can vary from local, regional and national governments to private industry. Hydropower companies, for example, have a very clear direct interest in compensating upstream land users to avoid deforestation, for example, because it clogs up their reservoirs. And so instead of having to dredge every year and pay a substantial cost for dredging of the sediments that flow into the river system, they compensate, and it's cheaper for them to compensate upstream land users to prevent the soil from entering the water system in the first place. So private companies like hydropower plants have been very successful in existing PES schemes.
What would you say are the most pressing challenges when it comes to implementation?
I think the challenge is really to make sure that the PES scheme is fit to the environmental problem involved. There has to be a clear relationship between the environmental problem that you're trying to solve and the instrument that you're using, in this case PES. If that relationship is not there, it will be very difficult also to provide insight in the costs and benefits of setting up a market-based instrument like PES and convince the beneficiaries to pay for the benefits that they apparently or seem to enjoy from the ecosystem services.
I mean, in theory, are these schemes applicable in any watershed, any society, or is there any limits to their applicability in terms of different places, different levels of development, different hydrological circumstances?
Yeah, so it again depends very much on the local circumstances, the environmental problem involved, but also the institutional economic context, the regulatory framework that is in place. The PES scheme is not something that you can implement in complete isolation of the institutional framework in which it has to be embedded. You need strong institutions that can impose the PES support, the PES scheme. It's very important that there are laws and regulations that secure the property rights to the ecosystem services, for example, once you start paying to them. And there are also effective enforcement mechanisms in place on the side of the ecosystem service provider. Cultural differences may play a role as well. Some governments believe more in bottom-up community-based projects as an alternative to creating a market system, for example, to solve some of these environmental problems.
So do you often meet resistance from local stakeholders that resent the idea of having to pay for such services?
I think there is resentment. You have to be very careful what exactly you trigger once you start introducing money into the protection of ecosystems and the services that they provide. The market system can never operate outside the biophysical boundaries that are imposed by the water system, for example, in this particular case for payments for watershed services. And it's, as I mentioned, always the case that these PES schemes usually come in combination with other existing regulatory frameworks. Awareness raising campaigns to make people aware of the benefits that are provided by ecosystems can in itself already be a very effective and also cost-effective way of protecting the environment.
Are there any good examples you can point to as to a successful case where a PWS scheme was implemented that proved to be effective in dealing with the watershed issues?
Yeah, it's these user finance schemes. I think that there we have some examples where the downstream users of water, of clean water without sediments, without pollutants, where there is a clear relationship between the quality of the water, the sediment loads in the water, and the upstream land users that affect the flow of water that is used downstream. In these cases where there is such a direct causal relationship between what happens upstream and downstream, I think the introduction of PES schemes can be very beneficial. It's still very important in those cases to demonstrate the costs and benefits involved. That means the upstream land users have to be compensated at least for the conservation efforts that they undertake, and in the case of the downstream water users, the price that they are paying, it has to be less than the costs of treating water, for example, if there would not be a PES scheme in place.
Is there any particular locations that illustrate a successful PES scheme? Can you point to any place? You mentioned Bolivia or China, or any place in particular where you could say it actually has worked well?
Yeah, I think Costa Rica has traditionally been a place where a lot of those kind of initiatives have proven to work fairly well. It has also a historical tradition in ecotourism, where visitors from outside are asked to pay to visit their national parks. There are a number of cases where hydropower plants, for example, are involved in mountainous areas where these schemes seem to work most.
And since it's a relatively new economic policy instrument and the drivers of environmental performance are still rather poorly understood, what sorts of research and perhaps field tests are needed to expand the use of payments for watershed services?
I think there is a clear lack of empirical evidence on both the environmental side and on the impacts that the introduction of a PES scheme has on society, on communities. So the change in behavior in land use, for example, has to be better understood. So I would make a plea for introducing more small-scale field experiments in certain areas with local communities to see what the introduction of a monetary compensation mechanism for the provision of ecosystem services has on their current behavior. It's very important to understand what the baseline conditions are, how they currently work with the land and with the water, and what the incremental effect is of introducing a payment scheme, for example. That is really relatively poorly understood. And even in well-known cases in Costa Rica, where there is already a tradition of environmental protection, ecotourism, the incremental impact of the PES schemes in some cases has been negligible, because there has already been so much done in the past to reverse deforestation trends, for example, and the impacts that these deforestation trends have on water quality.
Perhaps we could talk a bit about your work at the Water Institute. I suppose you do the theoretical heavy lifting, some empirical analysis of these schemes. How does that relate to where they're actually implemented? What's the sort of the chain of from theory to actual field implementation? How does that work? Do you work together with some NGOs? You work with local authorities in different countries, or how does that go about?
Yeah, well, you see that there is an increasing demand from NGOs to get scientific support for the work that they do, and the advantage that we have in the University of Waterloo, the Water Institute, is that we have the different disciplines available on both the science side and the social science side to assess in a more comprehensive manner what the impacts are of PES schemes on both the environment and the ecosystem services provided by the environment, and the communities involved, the social impacts, the behavioral changes. And I think from theory it is especially important to address these behavioral changes as well as these environmental impacts.
So at the Water Institute then you have economists, other social scientists, you also have engineers, natural scientists as well that all collaborate on particular projects?
Yes, so it's in particular the science and engineering is very strong in the University of Waterloo. Water technology innovation, especially wastewater treatment, for example, but also our role in informing policy and decision making on global hydrological cycles and the regional and local impacts of climate change, for example, on the water system is something that is very well researched. And that happens in collaboration and also with other sciences, social sciences. Water governance is in particular strong in Waterloo, and since I started earlier this year, I also aim to bring in more and more these economic aspects.
So are you convinced that this can scale up, that payments for watershed services could actually make a significant contribution to solving some of the global water resource management challenges?
I think it definitely has a role to play, but as I mentioned, it is not a standalone instrument. It has to be implemented, for example, within an existing regulatory framework. You need to have that regulatory framework to also legitimize the use of these payments schemes to ensure that property rights to these ecosystem services are guaranteed, to ensure that there is effective enforcement and compliance on the side of the ecosystem service providers. So it's often a search for an optimum mix of policy instruments, including such payment schemes, that I think will in the future help to reduce and alleviate the pressure on some of our increasingly scarce water resources.
Well, Professor Roy Brouwer, Executive Director of the Water Institute at the University of Waterloo, thank you very much for joining us here on the SIWI Sofa.
Thank you very much.
And thank you for tuning in to the SIWI Sofa. Stay tuned for more episodes throughout the World Water Week.